William James. So William James was writing in 1910. He was someone who was a self-declared pacifist. He was at the time, before World War One, reviewing America's history of armed conflict, and of course the big historical war at that time was the one from 1898, which was the Spanish-American War, and in this sense, he sort of is aware of a sort of an emergent jingoistic or imperialistic tendency on the part of America, which was very common in many countries of the world at that time. America was by no means an exception. And I think what I sort of see in this piece is an awareness on James's part that there's kind of two discourses, as he calls it. There's a paradoxical double personality at work in the American psychology vis-a-vis war, and he finds this paradoxical because it's sort of in his time, it's sort of the case that you're starting to see a transition where it's becoming impolite to want to go to war for the traditional reasons. Those would be the reasons of Machiavelli, which I mentioned earlier on, who would have called, for us to embrace what he called pagan values, the values of glory, power, loot, booty. Now, in the context of the rush up to World War One, you were having to express reluctance to go to war, and if you were going to go to war, culturally or morally speaking, in American popular culture, you would go to war, in the words of Woodrow Wilson, the president of the time, to make the world safe for democracy. So Wilson, the American president, takes the United States into World War One some years later, in the name of democracy, because he believed that World War One would be important for democratization and for world peace. So there's a sense then that these are sort of moral wars. And I think for James, this is kind of bizarre. He's aware of the kind of paradox of the fact that while it's considered rude and impolite nowadays to advocate or call for war in the old school way of, glory of war, the Roman kind of notion of war, the gladiatorial notion of war, he's aware that while people are being considered impolite for talking about that kind of thing, and this sort of almost erotic, to bring Freud back in, sense that of what war can be, is sort of fading into the past. He's aware of the paradox that while we are now, in a sense, looking down our nose at war and looking down our nose on those who celebrate the warlike virtues, the masculine virtues, the honor and the tradition of war, while we're looking down our nose at people who advocate those values, we are, in the same breath, advocating liberal causes for war, right? Making the world safe for democracy, etc. So the paradox of this is that, of course, to make the world safe for democracy, you both have to turn your back on those soldiering values that you've just been criticizing, while paradoxically calling for more soldiers in order to be able to actually get the job done. So in this sense, then, I think what, to me anyway, one thing that William James is kind of identifying is this paradox of this emergent kind of liberal conscience of when and how we're going to make war. And when I use the word liberal there, I want to be clear that I don't mean liberal in the sense of what Glenn Beck would mean when he says liberal, or what any Fox News commentator would mean when they use the word liberal. I mean real liberalism. I mean Enlightenment liberalism. Um, so the irony then is, in a nutshell, that as we start to hate war because we're all liberals now, we end up having more wars, because we are more determined than ever now to bring our values into our foreign policy and to advocate change and to sort of go on almost like a crusade for peace, a crusade for democracy. Not, of course, realizing or failing to recognize that a lot of the countries around the world don't quite want to live as we do, and so therefore when our values come into an antagonistic relation with theirs, oftentimes armed conflict is going to break out. Um, so a second dimension then, once we've talked about this paradox, then is this turn to address his core point, which is whether in the advent of this sort of new liberal sensitivity that people like Woodrow Wilson would have been displaying, what do you do then with this residual nostalgia that we feel, which of course Freud had talked about, right? Which is that we feel alive when we are in the presence of danger. So what do we do with this nostalgia for pagan values? Prior to World War One, there were a number of people that would have been concerned that these values were fading in their appeal, and of course, I mean, you don't need to be much more than an amateur historian to think or to remember that the slaughter of World War One on the battlefields of France and Belgium might have done a lot to kill off the spirit of jingoism. But James is nostalgic for this, what he calls the pleasure economy. And to me, that really evoked Freud, the pleasure economy of war. And you have to ask yourself, how do you feel about this idea, by the way, where he says that, and I think that the Freudian eroticism is present here. James thinks that war is, as he calls it, the welder of men into cohesive states. That it makes us perhaps more functional as a human being, gives us a greater sense of value, the value of life, the value of our what the French call esprit de corps. The spirit that we feel with our fellow soldiers, the sense of common purpose, the unity, the union. I at that point in reading the text, I sort of had to, and I confess I had to sort of pause in a second, because if you think about it, if you've met many veterans, and there are a lot of veterans living in the Chillicothe area, if you've met them, you'll be aware of the wounds that many of them carry, not just physically but also psychologically. Reading James talking about the pleasure economy of war and the idea of war as the welder of men into cohesive states, you'd be forgiven for thinking that perhaps he'd never met a veteran in his life. But that's just an editorial remark. I suppose the baseline point here is to try to remember Freud, and to remember how he said the death drive was partially this erotic thing. We don't like TikTok lives, the lives that modernity thrusts upon us. I think in the same breath we can remember Chris Hedges also saying that war is something that gives us purpose. So by some horrible quirk of evolution, maybe there is something to this idea that maybe not war itself, but going to war, preparation for war, the thrill of the idea that danger is just around the corner, that it actually does make us feel alive, and we can kind of get a certain chemical boost, adrenaline boost off that. There's been a lot of wars that historians have remarked as being kind of characterized by a popular spirit of preparing for war, the big push, etc. So I think in James's defense, perhaps we do need to see that this is a big part of being human. And this is really, I think, what his point is. He's saying he himself is a pacifist, but he's complaining that what pacifists need to see is what he calls this aesthetic and an ethical point of view. On the one hand, it's an aesthetic because, as he says, no collectivity is like an army for nourishing such pride. That's a great quote in there. No collectivity is like an army for nourishing such pride. The army will make you feel proud. You'll be proud of your fellow soldiers, and they'll be proud of you for your shared ordeal of training together, serving together. So there is that aesthetic sense of what war can do for us. On the other hand, there's an ethical perspective, which is that what other human institution gets the level of sacrifice from human beings that war can get? War gets the best out of us time and time again. We sacrifice our very selves in the prosecution of war. So, this leads us to our point that he is critical of those who sort of blindly celebrate military culture as sort of slaves to war. But also because he's fascinated by the aesthetic and ethical aspects, he's also critical then of people who are maybe, as he says, of the peacemaking party, that is, those who advocate peace. He's critical of them for not being able to see why people get so invested in war. The emotional, the aesthetic, the chemical rush of being prepared for war. So this man, of course, then a pacifist, a socialist, but noting in the same breath the weakness of his fellow socialists in their theory, because their theory sort of ignores this powerful capacity of war making to bring us together, to make us form as a people. One of the things that he's worried about with socialism is that people, one of the things that could really do socialism in would be if people started to abuse the system and become lazy. And of course, that's always, isn't it, the argument against socialism, which is that human nature is lazy, and you're going to have the hardworking people subsidizing the lazy people. But I think he's aware of that criticism, very aware of that criticism. And here he is with this theory or hypothesis that the thing that makes war virtuous can be applied to the cause of socialism, and it could actually be the thing that would give us the sense of common purpose that socialism and socialist theory to this point in time seems to be missing. If you have that soldiering mindset, that soldiering mentality in your socialism, then you might find that people are willing to invest their time and effort into making a success of it. They have a common sense of purpose, and they're not going to be the lazy person that we would worry about. So where does all this leave us? If you don't know the background of the story, I mean, James was actually and is often remembered as a kind of a precursor or founding father of what we know today as the Peace Corps, more subsequently AmeriCorps. So if you've not heard of Peace Corps or AmeriCorps before, it's a volunteer body that exists, set up in order to go around the world, Peace Corps at least, or AmeriCorps just domestically here in America, and work with people who might be of poor means, um, help them in their lives by doing service work with them, and it takes up to a year of your life to do this Peace Corps. So, you know, that's quite a remarkable thing. This essay, this argument put forward by William James is connected to this institution that exists today. I think the Peace Corps was set up by President Kennedy. AmeriCorps was set up by President Bush. And they both would acknowledge their debt to people like William James, but also specifically William James, as someone who had sort of argued for a secular, maybe secular is not the right word there, but a non-militaristic army, right? An army devoted to civilian purposes. That's pretty fascinating.